Well, good morning, fam. It is another edition of Unpublic with Citizen Stewart. Today I'm flying solo by myself. I don't have a guest today, but I did want to talk about a couple of things that were weighing on my mind as very heavy, specifically about what I'm calling the new Jane Crow, which is how the education system is a mass system of miseducation for Black children that is governed by patriarchal and also maternalistic ideas. And it is a business on one side, and it is a pedagogical jobs program on the other side, mostly for a very powerful interest group. So this is what we're going to do today. We're going to try and have just like a conversation. I should show you my shirt. I don't know if you can see it here. Take a look. Today's show is brought to you by the University of Ohio School of Parentology. If you'd like a shirt, you could go to citizenstewart.com and go to the store, and you can find one of these University of Ohio School of Parentology shirts. So today we are going to have a session of the University of Ohio and this is the School of Parentology, what we should be talking about. Let me set it up and let me frame it just quickly about how I think I want to look at today's topic, the new Jane Crow, how white women in education are foreclosing on Black minds. Michelle Alexander's best-selling book, The New Jim Crow, starts with a sympathetic character named Jarvis Cotton. He's a Black man who's convicted of murder, and he'd been denied the right to vote just as men in his family had been denied the right to vote for several generations. And Alexander, she could have easily told Jarvis's story through mass schooling rather than mass incarceration. The connection between educational failure and incarceration of Black men and the welfarization of Black women is tragically simple when you try and source out its origins. Low rates of proficiency in reading specifically during childhood very well predicts social and economic exile for those millions of people in later life when they become adults. More than 25 years after the advent of charter schools, more than 60 years after the unrealized public school benefits of desegregation, more than a century and a half since the Emancipation Proclamation that supposedly freed Black people, the right to education, literacy, good teaching, and government accountability for all of these things is consistently being blocked by powerful interests in the education establishment. Among those powerful groups within the education establishment are teachers' unions. You will hear me talk about them often, not because it's some sort of specific tick that I have for teachers' unions or any special animus that I have for them, just that they play such a central role in education in stopping and blocking things that matter to families, that matter to marginalized communities especially. And there's no way to get around that. So I would love to have lots of happy talk about all the good that unions do with their power, except for the fact of the matter is, if you ask yourself the question every single day, what are the things that are barriers to great education in the United States and an education system that can provide it equally and equitably across lines of race, and class, and geography? You can't get past one of the facts that will stare you in the face is that unions are at the nexus of blocking and resisting all of those things. I'm going to make a small case for that in this discussion today, and you are welcome in the comments. Light me up. Give me a hard time in the comments. Introduce facts to what I'm saying. Go against what I'm saying. Challenge any of it. I'm here for it because I believe we have to have more robust and honest conversations between each other about the things that are blocking us from having really great schools, really educated kids, and just more equitable outcomes for all. So let's get back to the unions. When I say that the education establishment is a powerful, powerful lobby, and that the unions within that powerful lobby are one of the most powerful, let's just talk about first who they are. Teachers' unions are mostly white, they're mostly women, and their power is without doubt amongst the strongest in education politics. And this is what I'm going to say about their power, and I want you to challenge me on what I'm about to say. Their power is not because of their creative ideas. Their power is not because the merit of their positions. Their power is not because they care about children, and not because they have a vision of a great public school for every child. Teachers' unions are effective because they have power, and they have power because millions of teachers pay hundreds of millions of dollars in dues to them to protect their rights and their interests as education employees. That's robustly simple to me when we think about what fuels their power. Now, before you challenge me on this one point, this is what I want to do. I just want to show you a video to support the point that I just made about the power of the unions, and then have you, in the comments, respond as you wish to this. Here we go. I'm going to play this for you. And tell me if you have trouble hearing this.
This is not to say that the concern of NEA and its affiliates with closing achievement gaps, reducing dropout rates, improving teacher quality, and the like are unimportant or inappropriate.
Oh, I'm going to start it from the beginning. Here we go.
And that brings me to my final and most important point, which is why, at least in my opinion, NEA and its affiliates are such effective advocates. Despite what some among us would like to believe, it is not because of our creative ideas. It is not because of the merit of our positions. It is not because we care about children, and it is not because we have a vision of a great public school for every child. NEA and its affiliates are effective advocates because we have power. And we have power because there are more than 3.2 million people who are willing to pay us hundreds of millions of dollars in dues each year because they believe that we are the unions that can most effectively represent them. The unions that can protect their rights and advance their interests as education employees.
Now, I just asked you, that's exactly what I just said, verbatim. So when I was reading that to you and I was saying that the power of teachers' unions is not because of their creative ideas, it's not because of the merit of their positions, it is not because they care about children. These are all things I'm looking through my text here that I took directly from the general counsel of the NEA giving a speech to the NEA about why they have power. And we need to start there. When we think about the new Jane Crow, we need to start thinking through who has power, how did they get it, and how do they maintain it. So when we think about who has power, definitely the unions that represent school boards, school administrators, school districts, and teachers unions are a powerful lobby in every single state in the United States. So often when I hear people say, we just aren't listening to teachers, we are creating big plans like Common Core and passing laws around how schools should operate without checking in with educators, I always have to laugh a little bit about it, because in my time of testifying on behalf of education reform legislation of visiting the Capitol to speak to elected officials about things that our children need in classrooms. There was never a time where I would visit a state house anywhere, and I imagine that this could be everywhere, where I didn't see those four horsemen of the apocalypse walking the halls, the teachers' unions, those who represent school districts, those who represent school boards, and those who represent administrators. And they would literally have such a presence there that when you would talk to elected officials as citizens about pieces of education legislation, they would have to reference anything you were asking for back to what they had been already briefed on or told by one of those four groups, sometimes five groups that represent the interest of education districts, like the establishment groups. So I also want to make a quick point about we love the language of equity and the language of kind of like woke politics. We love the language of mass incarceration, for instance, as an issue, because there's no real bad guy there. I mean, the closest thing within incarceration, mass incarceration, that you have as a bad guy are the evil politicians that wrote the legislation, and then possibly things like private prisons or the Prison Guard Association, which prison guard unions are very strong. But if you have the energy to talk about mass incarceration, you should easily be able to see that mass incarceration is an incestuous sibling with mass public schooling. So let me give you a couple of examples of things here that I think stick out to me more recently as examples. I'll start with an older example and then move on to more recently that make my point. When the students of California sued California, the state of California, to get better instruction and better teachers, you can go back and you can look at the testimony that the students gave in court. And the testimony was a range of things that were happening in under-resourced schools or in schools that served low-income students and students of color. They described teachers who fell asleep on the job. All the classic things that you would hear about the bad teacher stereotype. Teachers who were reading the paper in class, teachers who didn't care, or maybe cared too little, or had too low expectations. This was the students themselves who were saying this. They knew that they were being robbed of a good education. They knew that the education that they were receiving was different in their schools than it was in the wealthier schools. And here they are in court, having their day in court, to be able to give it to the state, to tell the state, we know that you are shortchanging us. You're shortchanging us in instruction and the quality of teachers that we should have. The teachers and the teachers union, their response to that claim was, number one, to say it's not that bad. It might only be 5% of teachers. Really? So if you have 5% of anything that's really bad, like cancer or something like that, you still consider that to be bad. But their response was, it's not that bad. It's not worth upsetting all of the teacher practices that we have in terms of hiring and firing and monitoring, just to basically take care of a problem that we consider to be very small. And the very small problem that they saw was, that these kids were getting bad instruction, poor instruction. But there was one thing that I looked at that I found in the middle of everything I was looking through for the Vergara case, when I was watching the videos and going through the news reports of it, and also looking through some of the transcripts. There was something I had never heard of before. I guess other people knew it, which was that by state law, a teacher position, a job, is property. So if you are attempting to separate a teacher from a job, you are depriving them of their property. And that set out shockwaves in my head, because I couldn't understand, number one, how can a public job be private property? How can somebody own a public thing? With all the talk we ever have about privatization, how could a teacher's position itself, a public employee's job, supposedly paid for by the public and owned by the public and accountable to the public, how could that be private property? But it was, right? And it's private property to that teacher. So if you are going to separate them from that, you need to go and document all kinds of very strong reasons why you would separate that teacher from their property, not their job. It's not like just being fired now. It's like, I'm taking your land. When I really thought about, like, nationally, if that's the case, and teachers are like 80% white and 80% white women, then teachers' jobs in the United States are white property. And basically, you are attempting, anytime we talk about education for children of color, we are bumping up against the system that really sees us as interlopers. They own the enterprise. I just told you that by the numbers. The teachers union professional just told you that that the reason they have power is because they have collectively combined and bundled their money to the point where they're too big to fail as an entity. So when I see Randy Weingarten and others, from the unions exerting an extreme amount of power over the way that our schools work and the way that policy gets made, it feels a little bit to me like Monsanto having its way with the EPA. That to me is gross, and it's a gross way to put it, but I can't think of it any other way. Let's go a little further into this new Jane Crow. So you have a mostly white, mostly woman profession that bundles its money and dominates state houses and law and blocks pieces of reform like charter schools, like teacher evaluation, teacher effectiveness, accountability, testing, anything that shines a light on the fact that the system is inequitable. And when I say the system, I mean their system. I'm not talking about the romantic vision of public education as a shared system amongst all of us that have equity within this democracy, because that's not what it is. What it is it's the property of an occupational group, a public occupational group who have bundled their money to overrun the enterprise. They're not alone, though. So the teachers don't do this by themselves because they have social and economic power. They are able to use their social networks and their social systems with people who are like-minded and affirming to them to extend their power into the electorate. And the way that they do that is, if you look at groups like, so let's just start at the godhead of the new Jane Crow. That would probably be people like Diane Ravitch, Carol Burris, people who lead what looks like a modern day temperance movement, where you have highly educated, well-heeled white women who run a system of indoctrinating other white women to be on board with the save our schools mentality. So you have things like Parents Across America, which is a very white, very woman, very middle-aged organization of people who see it as their sole kind of goal in life to protect and defend the system as it is now, and to defeat and resist anything that attempts to change the system in ways that they don't like. And some of those ways, most of those ways, involve reform. So they are resistant. Parents Across America, your local chapter of Save Our Schools, and Hands Across America, all these type of groups that pop up, defend our public schools, save our public schools, defeat the enemy, and all those things. Do you ever wonder why they don't call those Save Our Children, or Save Our Kids, or Save the Young People who are marginalized by inadequate instruction? Do you ever wonder why they say the school and why they say public education, defend those things? It's because that's their religion. Their religion is public education. And you are a heretic if you come in trying to change any of the major commandments of their religion. They don't care about the individual, the child, the person who's being shorted. They will send you all kinds of rosy and fluffy pieces about education being the cornerstone of democracy. But if that is true, if education, public education, is the cornerstone of democracy, and we think about what trouble our democracy is in right now, and we think about there are people who actually believe that Hillary Clinton was running a pedophile ring out of a pizza shop, And that the people who believe that, and the nation of them now, millions and upon millions of people who believe weird things that just can't be true by logic and by fact, they all came through this system. That's the cornerstone of democracy. So if it is the cornerstone of democracy and it's producing unequal results amongst people of color and whites, the rich and the poor, the educated and the non-educated, and it seems to be exacerbating some of those problems, and we're not getting a smarter citizenry, even at a time when we're the wealthiest we've ever been and there's the most information we've ever had. Well, how's it doing? How's that working out, that cornerstone of democracy thing? Not looking critically at the system that is educating the majority of people that become voters at some point, who are believing wildly stupid things. That might be a slightly different discussion for a different time, but I'm only making it to say we have to take off the glasses and look at the system for what it actually is, and stop all of this nostalgic, fluffy type of just weirdly nostalgic ways of looking at public education. I see you guys are ringing out in my comments here, and I appreciate you guys for it. I'm sorry I didn't take a look at it yet, because I was trying to get through some of these things here, but please keep commenting. If you have a challenge to anything that I'm saying, drop it in, put challenge in front of of what I'm saying, and I'll be able to see it easier. I do see Michelle Johnson. You put something in right away that rings my bell a little bit. Pastors for Children said if charters fulfilled their purpose, they would be cooperative, accountable, transparent, and locally controlled and selectively placed. Notice no mention of educating children. This is a really great point, because the group that you are mentioning, in Texas, they're called Pastors for Texas Children. In Oklahoma, they're called Pastors for Oklahoma Children, and so on. I think they're going into Florida and into Kentucky. If you look at who's running them, so first of all, I became aware of them because Diane Ravitch boosts the hell out of them and has interactions with them. So they are definitely Branch Ravitchians. They are people who have listened to the gospel of Diane Ravitch, which is 100% a hypocritical gospel for the imperial white mother. And if you want to know where I get the term imperial white mother from, it comes from research done by Professor Tommy J. Curry, who writes about critical race theory and writes about Derek Bell's vision of public education just in general. And he talks a lot about how we talk about the patriotic or the paternal father figure within racism and white supremacy, but we always leave the role that white women have played in the maintenance and the furthering of white supremacy. We leave them out of the equation oftentimes, and we do that because I think in some ways we see them as a version of part of the oppressed, but not part of the oppressor. And he goes all the way back to slave times to unearth the ways in which they fulfilled the role of what he calls the imperial mother. There's a book called The Mothers of Resistance, or I think it's The Mothers of Mass Resistance. If you look for that book and you find it, in that book, it talks about the role that white women played in maintaining segregated schools, for instance. So you've always had things, even before then, of white women collectives and organizations that yielded social power. The temperance movement and the suffrage movement might be for positive, but for negative, on other sides of the fence, you had things like the Daughters of the Confederacy and white citizens councils that were very white women domineering and driven. But when it came time to desegregate the schools, the maintenance of segregation in public schools was not just it. First of all, people don't talk about that. It was a lot of teachers and it was a lot of white women using their social powers, mothers and teachers working together in the same way that today Hands Across America and Save Our Schools work with Diane Ravitch and her group and teachers unions, Randy Weingarten, and it was Lily before, now it's Becky Pringle, to maintain the system as is and defeat any attempts to change the system greatly. So sticking on that point just for a minute, I'm not the only one who is saying these things. I just want to be very clear. This isn't me just making opinions about these things. If you go back and you look at the books that I'm telling you, look at a book called Uncivil Rights. In that book, it talks a lot about how the teachers unions originated, and much of the origination of teachers unions were white women teachers not wanting to teach in black and brown schools, not wanting to be forced to teach those kids necessarily because they saw it as a step down and not professional. So again, far from the pretty stories that we're told about the way that unions work, far distance from we're all in this together, because we're not. If you say save our schools, and my response is save our children, to me that starts to feel like the all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter thing. So you're saying all lives matter, save our schools, open schools for all, great schools for all. And I'm saying, but when you say that, you're missing entire populations of young people who've been marginalized for generations, legally, economically, politically, socially. We can't ignore the fact that your one great system, your one best system is not best for us and isn't working. So there's a challenge here. All right. So this comes from Toya Jackson. Challenge. Don't dismiss conspiracy theories without picking apart the pieces of truth in them. That is how truth is subverted, by grouping them together with ridiculous beliefs and then dismissing them as a whole. The devil is in the details. I have seen this trend in mainstream news. Toya, I don't know if you're talking specifically about, when you say don't dismiss conspiracy theories, I don't know if you're talking specifically about me talking about QAnon, and the theories of like the Clintons running a pedophilia ring out of, what's called Pizzagate, out of a pizza parlor, and those things. So I don't know how to rescue that in a way. I get what you're saying, because sometimes conspiracy theories have an element of truth to them that if you just wash them all away as ridiculous, then you're harming the public understanding of things that they should know. So here's what I'm going to say. I don't think that there's any doubt that the public schools are not generating citizens who are fully aware and abreast of how their government works, how life and science works, how to think critically when they do hear media reports of anything. I honestly believe that mass schooling and mass incarceration work so well together is because one incarcerates your mind while you're still young, and then the other gets your body later, and they both make money off of you. They both profit off of you. The average Black child walking into a school system right now is worth so much money. They're worth money in terms of counseling and big pharma and special programs and social work. And there's an entire army, a middle-class army of people who are completely dependent for their living, for their lives, on the existence of that Black body that comes in, having nothing to do with the mind. That child comes in, there's a lot of people that are earning their keep off of that child. And when you think about, oftentimes that same child will end up either in welfare or in prison. And that like 1 in 3 Black men could expect to possibly be in contact with the criminal justice system, and with pushouts and things regarding issues with girls, that many of them will end up dependent in one way or another financially, either upon government systems or upon men. You have to ask yourself what is happening in that starter system, that 12, 13 years in the starter system. What is happening there that it is doing such a good job of preparing you for 2 places you don't want to be, welfarization and mass incarceration, versus for life as free people. So I don't know if that answers your challenge. I'm clicking through really quickly here to see if there's any other challenges. So Mott says our class divide is more problematic as Black folks. And Mott, I don't know what you mean by that, but I feel like I agree with you. So when I talk about the system as it is, the unions mostly being of white women, and that this is a new Jane Crow that we're seeing, and that they are playing their role with the institutional fathers to keep us trapped in these systems, that even though they're leftist and they're woke and they believe that they're creating systems of resistance to white supremacy and whatnot, they're not. They're playing along. When I say that, it's not to leave out those of us that are participating in those systems uncritically, because we, along with our white colleagues and peers, are gaining pensions or the same type of benefits that they're gaining off of it. So it's not to our benefit to do anything other than slap on the same t-shirt that they slap on and fight for the same things that they fight for, and not fight for our people. Michelle Johnson, what else you got here for me? The parents are starting to turn on my district's teachers union. If the union loses too many parents, they lose power. This is really important because it's true. So in places like Oakland, for instance, and I could probably name a few others, white parents of means are now starting to get very tired of the school closings. They're starting to get tired of what they see as the schools unnecessarily being closed. And that's leading them into small skirmishes with the teachers union. Now, that had been a sisterhood. Wealthier parents who are well served by public education and getting all their needs taken care of because they get these little islands of privilege that we call public schools, they have been some of the firmest supporters of white teachers unions and the women in them. And they have like a social connection that has been very hard to break. But with COVID, and with this problem of kids being out of school for a very long time, they're starting to have enough. And you could see in many cases, they're starting to be the ones that turn on the unions in Facebook groups, and they're creating collective power, and they're pressuring their districts to go back to school, and the media is picking them up. So that's an interesting, ripple in the hard to break social power of things like, Save Our Schools and the teachers unions being so well united because they share demography. It's being tested now in a big way. So Michelle Johnson, I agree with you. Ray Ankrum, Brother Ray is here. Teacher ed programs suck. You become a good teacher the day you decide you no longer want to be a bad teacher anymore. I don't know what that even means, brother. Like, I don't even know what that means, but it does lead me to another place. Let me pop something else up here for us to talk about quickly, because it's always good for a local example. So here's my local example. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to find this story for you. If I can remember how to use my technology. All right, so if you've known me for any amount of time, you have seen me pull this story up before. So the story is now 6 years old. It's an older story. Minneapolis's worst teachers are in the poorest schools, data show. Minneapolis officials say they're taking action to balance needs with abilities. So this wasn't a particularly surprising or shocking story, not to those of us who had been watching the Minneapolis public schools for years. It was just a confirmation of what we already believed. But look right here, what it says, schools at risk. Schools with lowest observation scores, meaning the observation of teachers and their performance, and the percentage of students on free and reduced lunch. And right here, Bethune was one of the schools that hit the high water mark. The school for being like one of the worst with the kids that needed the best, right? So, so I'm going to show you a video. I should give you a little context about this. So this is a school that's in the paper on any given day being said that they have some of the worst teachers in the district. One of those teachers really didn't like what she was reading, so she came down to I don't know if it would be called protesting, but she wanted to push back on what was being said there. So let me pull up this video.
Perfect. Piggyback off of that. I'm Greta Callahan. I'm a kindergarten teacher at Bethune Community School. And what's missing is a basic understanding of what poverty and trauma look like, and what children right here, blocks away from here, right here in our city, are going through. Whether that's testing or how we greet our students in the morning, how we approach students and learning cannot be absent in our schools. School always should be consistent, stable, and safe. And as many of you board members know, my classroom is a sacred space filled with freedom and joy for 5-year-olds. Recently, I learned that I can no longer keep that promise of emotional safety to my classroom. Teaching and learning sat in classrooms around the district for 2 to 3 hours. My classroom was one of those. All we were told is that they wanted to see how benchmark was being implemented. I did not receive any more information, and I did not receive feedback. Did I mention this happened right before winter break? For my practice, that's wrong, but that's not my concern. My concern is for my babies. I have students dealing with everything from a sibling dying to living in foster homes, shuffling between shelters, having guardian ad litems watch them and observe them, and so much more. Yet so often we treat our students in schools with a one-size-fits-all approach. A stranger from the district sat in my room for 3 hours. This person did not introduce herself to my students, yet randomly approached my kids asking them academic questions. Some of my kids shut down completely, others acted out. The moment that woman left my room, one of my little girls started sobbing, uncontrollably shaking. I held her and I was like, baby, what's wrong? She said, Miss Callahan, why did that lady keep talking to me? For days, she asked me if that lady in the orange chair was coming back. If I get an observation from my principal who understands trauma, she asked me, what should I know? Is there anyone I shouldn't approach? It's not okay that this basic understanding of trauma is absent and missing from our district counterparts.
So there you have it. She gave the district a piece of her mind there. She came to say that basically my babies are in trauma. My babies are, you know, the reason that we are poorly rated as teachers in this school is because of the condition of our students, is the basic there. She's also making a challenge to how they do observations and how they conduct their, you know, their evaluations, which, listen, if you are being lowly rated, I don't believe that that anything else is going to happen except for you're going to challenge the system in which evaluated you, because you're not going to like what you're hearing. You're not going to like the information. But this is what I want to say about her, Greta Callahan, Miss Greta Callahan. At the time that she had done that, she wasn't a long-serving teacher. She wasn't like a vet in the district. At the time that she did that, she had just converted from being one of those teachers that used to speak out about equity. And we as teachers, she was more of a reform-oriented teacher. We need to do all we can and, you know, all that type of stuff to get equity for students, and they're not getting the best education, to being on the paper for being in a school with some of the poorest performing teachers. And then you see she's wearing a union t-shirt all of a sudden, right? This is some of the behind the scenes that people don't know. And she made this miraculous kind of like, she made this miraculous transition from being the reform teacher who thought, you know, we could, you know, we have to have high expectations and we can do a lot for our kids, to being the apologist for the system and the other poorly performing teachers that had just weirdly congregated in one school. Minneapolis has a history of allowing parents and teachers to be squeezed out of some of the best schools and being to find comfort in some of the schools where students need much better and need more. Her story doesn't end there, though. So Miss Greta, with that impassioned plea that's almost on the verge of tears, and you can just feel so sympathetic about who even somehow becomes the victim as the middle-class, college-educated person in the scenario who's lording over kids that will never be able to get a job beyond McDonald's if they don't get more than what she's giving them. she becomes the cause celeb. So Greta is now the president of the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, right? And she got that position by stepping over the bodies of people of color who were running for the same position. We've never had a person of color actually in that role. But she has perfected the language of trauma and poverty and the condition of children as an educational essentialist type of idea of why they're not doing well. Nothing to do with the level of instruction that they're getting or the curriculum or whether or not we have like we've done enough of our work around rooting out the various programs that don't work within Minneapolis public schools, which we've had curriculum audits and everything else to tell us that it's all wrong. But she's not dealing with that stuff. She's dealing with the condition of the kids, right? That's the new Jane Crow in a nutshell, right? Gets even a little bit worse when you think about the fact that teacher in one of the poorest schools doing the worst actually becomes the president of all the educators within the district. And it has perfected this language of BIPOC and standing together and allies and anti-Trump stuff and all the stuff that gets people clapping and, you know, standing together without asking, yeah, but what about the fact that y'all sabotage direct instruction in the district, even though everything that we had been told by Cambridge and other places told us that we needed it for our students because it actually works with our students? What about the fact that you guys consistently sabotaged the teacher evaluation process and wanted to keep in place something called PAR, peer assistance review, which was something that basically was a trick that allowed teachers to be in control of the review of other teachers so that none of them ever would get fired? What happened there? So I see a need to keep telling these stories locally, because here locally, if I wanted to go even further, there's a Greta in St. Paul. So now the Twin Cities is pretty much, in lockstep with each other. They report up to a state system to a person named Denise Beck, who is a similar looking woman with a similar haircut and a similar register and a similar vocabulary around trauma. And again, condition of the child is the problem. The educational institution itself doesn't need any changing. And all threats to that system, including charter schools or teacher evaluation or standardized testing or anything that gives those young people an option outside of New Jane Crow, or anything that puts New Jane Crow on trial with numbers and data and statistics, their power is complete. And then they report up to Mary Catherine Ricker, who has just recently stepped down, but has been our commissioner of education. Our commissioner of education, who was the St. Paul Teachers Federation Teachers Union president, became Randy Weingarten's number 2 at the AFT, and then came back as our commissioner of education. That is the system that we have. That's the new Jane Crow. It's a local poor performing teacher who becomes union president, responding and reporting upward to another person just like her at the statewide teachers union, who is in deep daily contact with a person just like her at the Department of Education. Their power is complete. Along the way, I should say, there have been some trailblazers and people trying to interrupt the new Jane Crow. For instance, like Valeria Silva, who was the superintendent in St. Paul. And she's so thoroughly pissed off the white women teachers of St. Paul with her equity and race initiatives that were meant to mainstream kids that weren't being mainstreamed, were meant to stop kids being cut out of some of the best classrooms who wanted to be there and needed to be there and deserved to be there. She so infuriated them that they banded together. They put their money together. They ran a slate of school board candidates with questionable cognitive abilities. That slate won. That slate immediately set about firing Valeria Silva, and they gave her $750,000 just to walk away. That's how important it was to them to not be challenged with equity, that they paid her $750,000 just to walk away and pretend like it had never happened. That is, my friends, a big, big version of the new Jane Crow. Let me back up and go back again to just something, and then I'm going to read, maybe a couple of your comments and see if anybody has anything that's challenging or that they want me to answer for. like, Chris, you're getting it wrong. But right now, if we look at the way that like districts are negotiating with their teachers about whether or not our students will have in-person learning or not, how many hours or minutes of in-person learning they'll have or not, it's leaving parents out, taxpayers out, districts out, and it is the ultimate new Jane Crow negotiation system. Districts are literally not negotiating with us, the people who fund them and who are the most affected by them. They're not negotiating with us when, where, and how our kids are going to be educated. They're negotiating with the leaders of the new Jane Crow about when, where, and how we will have school or not. It was brought to my attention that Los Angeles is a really good example of how this is going down. So it's almost $1 billion, I think, and I'll check this number. People should check with me later about this. The reduction in teaching time that the teachers have been able to negotiate in Los Angeles amounts to almost $1 billion worth of lost learning time, instructional time. And who's paying for that? The taxpayers of Los Angeles and of California and of the United States are paying for their don't teach, still get paid agenda that the teachers have there. And looking at some of the transcripts of the negotiations that they had in Los Angeles, and I should say that parents have sued the district and the unions for their negotiations. You saw things pop up in the transcripts like the teachers union folks saying that they were getting tired of hearing the district talk about parents all the time and prioritizing parents and parents this and parents that. And they were literally not wanting to teach. And they found every way and every angle to say that they should not be teaching as much. Even as the district was telling them, we really see a serious problem. Our kids need way more live instruction than they're getting. Teachers didn't want to give live instruction. They wanted to give the take attendance and then point you to some resource and you go teach yourself, basically, right? Now we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that are invested in the new Jane Crow in this district. And Jane is saying to Crow, like, listen, we're not going to do this for the kids. We don't care how many minutes you think that they should have. We don't think we don't care if you think it should mimic a normal school day that we used to have before. The most we're going to do is 3 hours and some change mostly. And we don't want to be made to do that in any specific way. We want to do that in any way that fits the individual teacher's ability to teach. So if you say synchronous, which means, we need to be in sync, the kid needs to see us and we need live instruction or whatnot, maybe we're for it, maybe we're not. We just don't want you telling us exactly how to do that. We cannot talk about that without talking about power. Where's the power in that situation? The children of Los Angeles need live instruction. They were already behind before we went into a pandemic, but when we went into a pandemic, all hell broke loose in their lives. So when Greta Callahan and the ones just like her everywhere else, when they get before cameras, they talk the language of our babies. Our babies. Our babies need food. Our babies need water. Our babies need this. Our babies need that. Our babies need everything except for live, high-quality instruction. I don't know how you get around the challenging of the difference between the public persona of New Jane Crow and the private discussions of New Jane Crow. In public, they are BIPOC allies who love their children, who just want a strong system for all and are fighting against the billionaires and the evil politicians and everybody else who are trying to make them do things that are not good for kids. Except for in private, they're saying, we don't want to teach. And we just want more money and less accountability. We don't want to be observed. We don't want to be evaluated. We don't want to be watched. We don't want to be tested. We don't want our kids being tested. We don't want any data or evidence that shows when we're not doing well. We don't want to do any more than our contract says that we need to do. Now, someone watching this is going to say, well, Chris, you're taking it too far. This is, teachers just really want to do the best for our kids. They want to do, blah, 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 blah. We have too much evidence about what New Jane Crow is doing that is nasty and deceitful and is trapping young people into systems that are putting them on trajectories for bad lives, for lives that are in economic exile or in jail or in welfare or in one way or another being in circumstances that we would never allow if it was happening to large groups of white, well-heeled children. So this lovely language that we like to fall into, we have to stop it. We have to stop talking about our schools and our teachers, right? Chicago's teachers union, they've perfected this, this race baity type of, reopening schools is white supremacy. And they literally have dumb people sitting around parroting and repeating their words that to actually give young people who need an education live instruction and to make sure that it's high quality and that it can be proven to be high quality through assessments and other things is white supremacy. But putting them before teachers who have no accountability and who for their own children are doing something totally different, that's not white supremacy, right? It's the billionaires that want this work. But yet no one ever talks about the fact that Jesse Sharkey, the president of the Chicago Teachers Union himself, is part of the 1%. His family owns the Royal Caribbean Cruise Line. Like, you can't make this up. Like, you can't make this stuff up. We have got to get to tougher language and tougher understandings and using a tougher mental model for how we understand the system that our kids are trapped in. Let me go to some of your comments here. Well, Raymond Ankrum says these ain't our schools. Again, that should be a new T-shirt. These ain't our schools. The New Jane Crow owns the schools, and we're not part of the New Jane Crow. Just so you know, be careful how you tell that. William Conrad, thank you very much. He says your presentation is right on. Toya Jackson says teachers that want to do the best, do the best. And I think that means don't be about it. Don't talk about it, walk about it. Do the thing that you say that you want to be. Be the person you want to be. Michelle Johnson says, Chris, Unpublic is supposed to be about solutions. Please end with at least one. Okay, now see, Michelle, you should have put like challenge before that, because that is a challenge to everything that I'm saying right now. And it's a good challenge. But here's what I'm going to say. The solutions to what I'm talking about right now are not simplistic, and they cannot be done by simplistic thinking people. So there is no one silver bullet. Our children need a coherent educational program that is led by instructional leaders who have a demonstrable record of understanding teaching, learning, instruction, and outcomes. Our kids need and deserve the highest quality of teachers as evidenced by how they have been trained and the type of outcomes that they get. So there is no one solution here. We need to stop the resistance to improving and reforming teacher colleges and teacher prep programs. We need more teachers of color who have an understanding of and a familial relationship to the students that they serve. We definitely need to get over some of the education wars on things like direct instruction, the science of reading, the how we teach rather than just always fighting about the what we teach and the culture wars. Got to get out of the culture wars and get into the pedagogical science of what works and what doesn't work. And there are guideposts on the way there. Karen Chenoweth's work around It's Being Done, like her book, It's Being Done. And there's a book of what the best teachers do. The science is there. So we should not be arguing about what makes a good quality education or how to get there. It's there and we have it. We're just getting lost in the education war battles. I can't talk about, if we were to talk about the new Jim Crow, the mass incarceration, there was a real kind of the solutions there are found in law and policy. We changed the laws and the policies, things very specifically, for instance, like the difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. We need to find that we need to root out the educational equivalent of those policies that damn our students to ineffective teaching and poor pedagogical methodologies. We need to root out those systems. And I think it starts in two places. You can start up high with state policy around how much choice students should have to find the teachers that they need in the schools that they need, what the standards should be. How do we know that the schools are being accountable to the standards, not to anything else, but to the standards and to getting students to the standards? Also happens on a lower level, though. A lot of what I talked to you about today takes place. You could find out ways to do better just by watching your school board, watching their meetings, watching what they're arguing about, what type of plans they have, and injecting yourself with them to find out what is your plan for changing the terrible outcomes that you are having with specific subgroups of students, right? And if they don't have one, then the political pressure is on local people to either lead or leave, one or the other. So if you don't have a plan, you need a plan. If you have a plan, we need a way of monitoring and knowing how it's going, right? Every superintendent that comes into the district comes in with a PowerPoint of how they're going to change the pillars, of education. Year one, everybody's happy dappy saying we're putting it in place. Year two, it's starting to show signs of either working or not. And year three, oftentimes they're being courted to be a superintendent somewhere else. The only thing that's constant is you as the taxpayer and the parent, to keep the school board honest about the progress that they're making. I don't know if that helps your challenge, Michelle Johnson. William Conrad, thank you so much. Sherry Lucas Hall, thank you. Most of the school board meetings are virtual. You can watch in your PJs. Now, this is something that I love as one of the silver linings of COVID. Is I've been able to watch a lot more school board meetings from cities that I have no connection to, but I just want to see what they're talking about. And it's very enlightening. I would very much encourage anybody watching here to take it upon yourself, if you're a taxpayer, a local resident, a community member, a parent, whatever, just to watch what your board is talking about and what they're thinking. So Debbie Meyer says the science is there. Teaching colleges and principals need to get on board. That's a solution, Michelle Johnson. They need to get on board, but how do we enforce that? How is our activism pushing them to get on board? William Conrad says transforming the colleges of education is critical. We know this. We have the research. We have things telling us that ed schools are cash cows. Oftentimes, they are a wide open funnel that is letting too many people in who have no business teaching our babies. Once they come out of these insufficient colleges, oftentimes they have trouble passing the state tests, like praxis or whatever test that they need to take to be to move from being candidates to actually being teachers and being licensed. And then once they get into districts, oftentimes they're entering into districts that have terrible support for teachers, have incoherent educational philosophies and models, and aren't doing all they can to continue the education of the teacher. The teacher is learning so much on the job rather than all the massive groups of people that are being paid to help them be better and to understand the work that we do, or the work that they do, I'm sorry. David Castillo says, our children need and deserve a national union that is independent. And I have said that for a long time, but I recently come to say something different, which is, I don't know if the union is the right construct. I think it's a industrial area construct. It's been very successful for the new Jane Crow. I don't know that it would be similarly successful for parents, because we have very different types of parents with different needs and different families. And I think there just needs to be a way for us to fight for everybody to have what they need, not just one single agenda. I might need something totally different than what you need. You and I should have a pact with each other that we'll fight for each other. You get what you want, I get what I want, but we don't have to want the exact same thing and don't have to have one agenda and one way of doing things. And David also said, glad I tuned in. Real talk, David. I love it. I appreciate it. This is me flying blind and solo for a day. But listen, I do want to wrap up here and just say that if you buy my premise that public education is a version of the new Jane Crow versus the new Jim Crow, then I hope you buy my premise that if you believe that, then you believe that in the same way that we dismantled the new Jim Crow through policy, through laws, through social changes, through calling out and call outs and public awareness and making the public aware of the problem and where the problem lies, is the same level of energy that we have to have for mass schooling. Mass incarceration and mass schooling are not two separate systems. Mass schooling is a precursor to mass incarceration, right? There's a reason why I think it's 77% of people who are incarcerated are people who have not reached functional literacy, have not reached literacy, period. And that if you were to trace back where they came from educationally, how their world fund of information was done, you would find there's lots of sociological factors that supported where they ended up. But you would also find out that those 12, 13 years that they spent in a public education system was a great starter prison for where they would end up later. Low expectations, putting them on lower tracks, teaching them early on that they were lesser than and that their minds were lesser than, and giving them every indication that they had never done anything in the world, that their people had not been successful contributors to humanity and to the to world civilization. All of these things add up and they compound over time. Children start in preschool and in kindergarten with boundless energy and unsurpassable worth. And little by little, we chip away at that. For some kids, we just support their boundless energy and their sense of self, their greatly inflated sometimes sense of self. And then for other kids, we do the opposite. We chip away at it slowly but surely through our rules, our interactions, our tone, our way of talking, our over-policing, our over-management, our inability to see the brightness and the brilliance in places that we haven't been trained to see it, which very specifically, America has never been trained to think of Black people as intelligent beings. Only God has had our back on that one. So that's where I want to wrap up today. I appreciate you all for watching. I did not intend to go on for an hour, but I appreciate you all sticking with me for an hour on this. If you have any thoughts, suggestions, pushback on this, any ways you think I could have framed it better, or any subjects that you think for a future Unpublic, please send them to me. You can email me at chris@hey.com, and that's just hey, H-E-Y, like hey you guys. You can just email me, chris@hey.com, and I will get back to you and we can talk more about any information you may have for a future broadcast. As always, let's fight for these kids. Let's dismantle New Jane Crow and let's do it together. We have lots of work to do.